1 in 4 of us will die of heart disease, which is better than 50 years ago when heart disease took out half of us. We'll talk with a Harvard cardiologist about what we can do to have a long, healthy life and ask him what it's like to hold a beating heart in his hand and other remarkable stories. This is New England Authors. Dr. Haider Javed is an acclaimed Harvard cardiologist and author of 3 books, and his latest is The State of the Heart, which we're going to talk about. Welcome to the show, Dr. Haider.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh, good. You start with a history of heart science, beginning with Egyptian times. Tell us how the heart, which we all know is a muscle, became the symbol of love, the symbol of Valentine's Day, and how did it get that shape that we have today?
So I think, the heart is special in the sense that, all of our organs are essential for our life, but many of them work in, what I like to call bureaucratic silence. So, your kidneys are working all the time, but you don't really feel them, as is your liver, for example. But, the heart is dynamic. It when it works and it works extra hard, it wants you to take notice. So for example, like when you are being chased by some wild animal, or you just got almost run over by a car, your heart starts pounding,
right?
And you can feel it reverberate through you, and it seems to or on the other hand, if you, for example, are very relaxed and you've just had like a big meal or something, it'll slow down. And so in some ways it almost follows how you feel. In fact, it does follow how you feel. And so that's why it was always really, really connected to human emotions,
right?
In a way that really no other organ has. And that's why it's captured the imagination of not just scientists and researchers, but poets and writers, since really when we first started to begin to put our thoughts down.
What drove you to study, become a cardiologist and study the heart?
Well, one of the things that drove me to become a cardiologist was that heart disease is incredibly common, and it is even more common in people who are from South Asia. So I'm from Pakistan, and I really grew up being surrounded by middle-aged, mostly men, but also women, who were having chest pain, who were having heart attacks, who were really having their lives cut short by heart disease. And it would often be very dramatic. Someone would go from being totally fine having dinner to passing away in just minutes, moments.
Yeah.
And so there really was that aspect was one. The other is that, and this is changing a bit, but heart disease is still one of the diseases that you can really alter the trajectory for, that you can take someone who may be on the verge of death and be able to pull them back, whether through the right diagnosis, the right medications or procedures. So it can carry a very dramatic course, although that's changing now, and heart disease is increasingly becoming more of a chronic condition that people just live with, rather than one that you can just magically make go away. So there's many things that drove me to it, but I would say that those two things, the experience of growing around so many people with heart disease. In fact, my grandmother, died of a cardiac arrest, and very suddenly my dad had a heart attack while I was a cardiologist in training. It really touched me, as it has so many other people.
Yeah, you point these out in your book. In fact, your book is a lot of stories about patients and your family, and as well as pioneering researchers. Why did you want to make this book so personal?
Well, I think because it reflected, how I had approached this space. I approached the sort of study of cardiology from a personal place, but also it's, stories are so central to my work as a physician. Every time I meet a patient, I'm learning their story. I learn all the medical information, but really buried in there is a human being that I'm getting to know, getting to understand, and sort of sharing a part of their life with them.
Yeah.
Sometimes those can be some of the most dramatic moments of their life or their family's life, and sometimes it can just be Thursday afternoon. You're just checking in with your doctor.
Yeah.
But I really felt that storytelling was the reason why I was interested in medicine, why I was interested in being a physician, and that it made sense that if stories were what drew me to this, then they would draw other people into this as well.
Can you briefly describe the 4 parts of the heart?
Sure. So the heart sits right under sort of the left side of your chest, beneath your ribs. It's, people say it's about as big as your fist. And the heart can be divided into the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart. The right side of the heart is the part of the heart that's receiving blood from all of your body as it comes back from your brain, from your arms and legs, and it enters the right side of your heart. Then the right side will pump the blood to the lungs, and this is where it gets imbued with oxygen.
Right.
And then it goes back to now the left side of the heart, which then pumps it to the rest of the body.
Yeah.
So it's the left side of the heart is really the muscular part of the heart that really, it's the part that you can feel pumping or sending pulses throughout your body when you feel the pulse in your wrist or in your neck or in your leg. And the right side of the body is really taking in blood from your entire body and then pushing it to the lungs where it gets oxygen, and so on and so forth. And this cycle continues really, long before we emerge into this world. The heart is one of the first few organs that forms in the fetus, and it really doesn't stop until the very end.
Right. Yeah. And there's this beautiful description you have of the blood going into all these little capillaries, from the arteries to the little capillaries all over every part of the body, bringing oxygen in there. Now, you say that the nature of heart disease is changing. Is that right?
It most certainly is changing. And heart disease is, what do we mean when we talk about heart disease?
Yeah.
I would say that heart disease can be divided into 2 major categories. One is this sort of chronic process called atherosclerosis. And most people have not heard of the word atherosclerosis, even though it is the #1 cause of death and disability in the world. Well, what is it? It is basically the slow buildup of cholesterol-laden plaques in the blood vessels in your entire body. This process starts very early. In fact, if you take adolescents who live in high-income countries such as here, you will find early evidence of atherosclerosis even in those kids. This process develops over decades and decades and decades. And sometimes when these blockages become really unstable or critical, these plaques in the blood vessel can basically explode. They rupture.
Right.
And it causes the body's immune system to come surging in as it tries to get things under wraps. One of the ways it does that is by forming blood clots. And that's exactly what happens when you have a heart attack. What happens is that this is your heart, and there are blood vessels that supply the heart with oxygenated blood. And if one of these sort of plaques in one of these blood vessels explodes, the immune system will form a blood clot there. And this is what a heart attack really is. If the same process happens in your brain, you have a stroke. If the same process happens in your leg, then you can have limb ischemia, and this is one reason why people may have to actually have their legs amputated. And so this is when people talk about heart disease, I would say this accounts for the vast majority of cases of heart disease. And then but what happens, and what we've done is that over the last few decades, we've become very good at treating people who have heart attacks. So heart attacks used to be almost certainly fatal diagnosis.
I see.
But now we help people live through heart attacks. But many people get older and they develop what's called heart failure. And I would say that's the second sort of big bucket of heart disease, which is more of a chronic condition in which the heart is unable to do sort of some of its basic responsibilities, which is to send blood to the rest of the body, but also receive blood from the rest of your body as well. This is more of a chronic condition and is actually the leading cause of hospital admissions in the country.
Yeah.
So even though we're getting better at treating people with heart attacks, the number of people who now live past these heart attacks to develop heart failure is actually going up. So yes, in fact, it is changing.
This is New England Authors. We're speaking with Dr. Haider Javed. He's a Harvard cardiologist and written a very interesting book called The State of the Heart. Tell us about, you talk about many studies that went on, and one of the ones that you talk a lot about is the Framingham study, which was conducted very close to here in New England. That was one of the first major studies, wasn't it? And it's going on still, if I remember, if I read your book correctly.
Sure. So the Framingham Heart Study is, I would say, easily one of the most influential studies that informs our understanding of human health and human disease today. And it really was started by the National Institutes of Health. When they were first formed after the Second World War, at that time, heart disease was killing every other American. So 1 in 2 Americans was dying of heart disease or its complications. So it was a huge issue. It still is. And at that time, even though we had defeated the Axis forces, we were losing at home to heart disease. So the question was, well, how do you go about to understand it better? And at that point, the idea became that the best way to study heart disease might be to actually understand what causes heart disease and how can we prevent it. And one way that we decided to do that was we took the town of Framingham, which was very close to Boston. And the reason that was picked was because many of the leading cardiologists of that time were all based in Boston, and they would have access to this population. And what they did was that they basically collected a population from Framingham and enrolled them in the study and just collected data from them over a long period of time. And one of the
when did this start again? It started right after World War II.
So it started in the 1960s, if I'm correct, and 50s or 60s, but I believe in the 1960s. And it made some seminal contributions to how we understand human health. So this term called risk factor, which is something that we use very commonly, actually emerged from the Framingham Heart Study. And we realized that things such as smoking, high cholesterol, high blood pressure were all risk factors for heart disease. And all of these insights really came from Framingham. And now we've reached the point where the siblings and the children and grandchildren of the initial Framingham cohort are now being studied. One of the weaknesses of the Framingham Heart Study was that Framingham as a town is mostly white. So a lot of the findings were not generalizable to other populations, but that's just a minor quibble, and that's now been overcome with studies that have a more diverse population. Yeah. But Framingham is, I think, a great example of what we can achieve when we invest in science, when we invest in research, because it really has revolutionized and continues to advance our understanding of how we can live better, healthier lives.
So how much of heart disease is hereditary and how much of it is our life?
So I think... I'll first off by saying the easy answer, which is it's a bit of both. We know that even if you look at ancient human beings, so when they've looked at mummies in Egypt, or when they found these artificially preserved ancient humans in the Swiss Alps, for example, and they looked at the hearts, they found that they had evidence of atherosclerosis. So atherosclerosis is not a new disease, but it is. But the number of people who died of heart disease has certainly really exploded in the last century. And to me, what that suggests is that something changed in our lifestyles, how we live, that has really caused this. So if I were to say of the amount of the number of people who have heart disease, I would think that more of it happens because of some of the lifestyle choices that we make or society makes for us. And really, another big thing that's related to this heart disease is socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
People who have resources to be able to, have jobs that are 9 to 5 and are not doing night shifts, and have access to good nutrition, or can
Yes.
go to the gym, or live with, don't have a fractured social network, and can afford to take medications, can afford to see all of these factors are really strongly related to protecting people from heart disease, which also again suggests that maybe it's not so much genes, even though I do think that there are some genetic predispositions that that may be at play, but largely at this point it is a disease that's an economic disease, that's a lifestyle disease.
Interesting. Yeah. So we went out with my primary doctor the other night, and he's actually a cardiologist as well. So I told him that I'd be interviewing you, and I asked him a few questions. So, for example, there have been trends in cholesterol. You cite this in your book. Mm-hmm. So there have been concerns about, you cite about all these things, about wine, drinking wine, whether that's good or bad, and it goes up and down, drinking coffee. What about cholesterol, especially the LDL cholesterol? That has a very large bearing on hearts.
Correct, and I would say that for all the things that there's a lot of fake news out there as far as health is concerned, but I would say that cholesterol is probably one of the best studied molecules that exist in our body.
Most famous.
Very
Yes.
famous, right? It's very democratic. It's not just something that doctors talk about, but people talk about as it's part of their daily life. People really, really care about cholesterol. It's one thing that's been able to escape the clinic and has really become a part of normal conversation.
Yeah.
And I would say that the vast majority of research that we have today would strongly suggest that a high LDL level in your blood increases your risk of heart disease, stroke, and other sort of vascular complications. And that lowering that LDL, whether you do it with medications or whether you do it through lifestyle changes, is associated with reducing your risk of heart disease. And I think that there's a lot of ambiguity in medicine. There's a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of known unknowns and unknown knowns that whatever Donald Rumsfeld would say. But I think this is one of the things that I can say with certainty is that we can make those connections pretty clearly. So that's and then there's some debate about LDL cholesterol, which you mentioned, which is the the bad cholesterol. But then there's also a good cholesterol called HDL, and LDL basically takes cholesterol from your liver, and then basically will deposit it in your body, which will then develop these plaques, which could then potentially rupture. HDL does the opposite thing. It scavenges cholesterol from the rest of your body and gets rid of it from the blood vessels. We know that if your HDL level, which is the good cholesterol, is high, your risk of having heart disease is lower. What we don't know is changing that HDL with medications actually helpful, and that has actually borne out to not be true.
Yeah.
So increasing your HDL with medications so far has not really been shown to have a clear benefit.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. This is New England Authors. We're speaking with Haider Javed. He's a cardiologist at Harvard, written a book called The State of the Heart. I wanted to ask you, my brother had a heart attack, and he changed his life after that. Mm-hmm. He ate differently, he got rid of stress in his life, and so on. About how many of your patients who have had heart attack make that life change?
It's a great question. For a lot of people, a heart attack can be the moment when they go from being healthy and feeling like they're invincible to suddenly feeling like they're mortal, that they're in fact not invincible, that they need to take care of their health. A lot of times I meet patients who have just had heart attacks, and I ask them, do they smoke? And they say yes, and I tell them, let that be the last cigarette you ever smoke.
Do they follow?
Well, some people do, and some people don't.
Uh-huh.
And that there's a lot of variation in it. Obviously, smoking is extremely addictive, and it's one of the hardest things to sort of quit. But if something is going to push you to quit it, it's going to be something as shocking as a heart attack.
Right.
And so what I understand is that even though a heart attack is a terrible thing, I hope it never happens to someone, it also presents an opportunity where you can really help people focus on their health and take themselves seriously in a way that they may not have done so before. So I use that opportunity to really motivate people and to give them agency. I think that's the other thing that's really important. It's not just to have people feel like they have no agency or control over their health, but by empowering them and telling them that through lifestyle changes or through taking medications that are evidence-based, they can in fact prevent the next heart attack. So I do think that it can be a powerful motivating force.
Could I ask you one thing about baby aspirin?
Please do.
Yeah, do you recommend it?
So, great question. And again, it is humbling. The story of baby aspirin is humbling for most physicians, I would say. Aspirin started off as something that we prescribed in heavy doses, high doses. We realized that maybe we were doing too much, and then we started giving aspirin in lower doses. And we thought that for most people, it's a good thing to take an aspirin to prevent heart attack before they've ever had heart disease. So if you've never had heart disease, if you take an aspirin, it will reduce your chances of having heart disease in the future. We know that if you've already had heart disease, significant heart disease, like if you've had a heart attack or stroke, that aspirin is beneficial, but we have not really had a lot of great data about what to do for people who've been healthy from a heart point of view. And recent data suggest that maybe it was not as useful as we thought it was. And that's because even though we call it baby aspirin, it's still not benign. It does increase your risk of bleeding. And so right now we are back to where we were, where there is uncertainty.
Another one of these cycles of things.
And I think, and some people can be discouraged by that, but really I think that is the essence of science. The essence of science is that, there is no straight path towards the truth, that we have to do all the heavy lifting. That means that we have to focus on science, focus on doing clinical trials that can keep answering even some of the questions that we may assume are have been solved and have been completely answered by previous generations. And so but what it comes down to is having a conversation with your physician, weighing the different risks and benefits that aspirin has. We know that aspirin reduces the risk of heart disease, but is that reduction in heart disease greater than the benefit, than the risk of bleeding? And I think that's why it really comes down to conversations like you've had with your primary care physician, both outside the hospital and inside.
I asked him about baby aspirin, by the way.
What did he say?
Well, he recommended it for me. Although I have a very nice heart, but he did recommend it for me. So you say that age is the biggest determining factor, right? What are some of the other determining factors? Blood pressure.
Sure. So I would say that the key risk factors for heart disease. So age is certainly a big risk factor. High blood pressure is the leading preventable cause of death around the world. Smoking is certainly something that is very clearly related to the risk of heart disease. High cholesterol levels are. We're also learning that stress is related to heart disease. When we first, at the start of the 20th century, stress was all the rage. And then it kind of went out of favor when we started focusing on other things like blood pressure, smoking, all the things I mentioned. But now I think we're starting to see renewed focus back on some of these other factors, such as stress, particularly work stress, has been shown to be associated with a higher risk of heart disease. But those are really the basics. There's a lot more we can do. Exercise is really, really important. And there's plenty of evidence to show that that's beneficial. But it starts with those things, and then there's really a sort of, that's really the entry point. There's so many other things we can do to take care of ourselves.
I have a lot more questions, but we don't have that much time. So you worked in a cath lab. What's that?
So a cath lab is a place where we do procedures called that involve cardiac catheterization, and these are really procedures that are done minimally invasively using catheters that are inserted either in the artery in the wrist or the artery in the leg. Usually the catheter will be snake it up all the way up to the heart, and use an X-ray machine to take pictures of, to let us know what we're doing. And this is a very common procedure. It's done for patients to make sure they don't have blood disease in the blood vessels around the heart, but it is also used to treat patients who are having heart attacks. So my dad, for example, himself had to go to the cath lab to get a stent when he had a heart attack. And it really is a special place. I think it allows you to be, moments I spend in the cath lab are some of the times when I felt most connected to my patients, most responsible to them. So it's really more than just a place where we do plumbing. It's really a spiritual place as far as I'm concerned.
And you approach your work as a spiritual experience, I think.
This is, what we do is we have this incredible privilege of having people allow us into their lives in some of their worst times, some of their best times. They trust us. How can it be anything less than a spiritual experience? I don't know.
Thank you very much for being with us. This is New England Authors. We're here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We broadcast on stations throughout the region. And if you missed a show, find it on YouTube, and remember, watch locally. Thank you.